The HOA didn't just build a fence around the new black man's ranch. It was a wall of rules and intimidation, designed for one purpose: to break him. They saw Silas Washington as an outsider who didn't belong in their perfect community. What they failed to see was the retired detective who knew that every wall has a weakness. So when they tried to fence him in, he didn't fight back with force. He fought back with a brilliant, simple move. He bought their only gate key. Join us for a story of quiet defiance that proves the smartest key can unlock the strongest gate. We invite you to subscribe to Deepu Kader Stories to see how it all unfolds. The Silent Promise. You can use a fence to cage a man. You can use the rules of a homeowners association (HOA) to try and break his spirit. What you never anticipate is that sometimes the answer isn't to tear the fence down. It's to buy their only gate key. The gate at Whispering Bluffs was a monument to order, a black iron testament to the rules of its chief architect, Evelyn Hayes. And on this Tuesday afternoon, Silas C. Washington, age 62, held its new master. Not a keycard, not a passcode, but a heavy, old-fashioned key for the manual override, and a sleek black remote that now controlled its soul. The Texas Hill Country wind, dry and relentless, whipped through his salt and pepper hair as he stopped his truck. He didn't get out. He just watched the gate for a long moment. This thing that had become the center of his world. Then, he pressed the button. The groan of metal was the sound of a paradigm shifting. The gate, the very barrier the HOA had used to isolate him for 6 agonizing weeks, slid open on his command, just as it began to move. A pristine white sport utility vehicle crested the small hill, coming to a screeching halt just feet from the moving barrier. Behind the wheel, Evelyn Hayes' perfectly manicured hand was frozen. Her face, usually a mask of composed authority, was twisted in pure, unfiltered disbelief. And then, rage. Silas did not smile. He did not wave. He simply met her gaze through the shimmering heat. Is the quiet, assessing stare of a retired homicide detective who had seen confessions in eyes far tougher than hers. Then, he put his old Ford truck in gear and drove through, leaving Evelyn Hayes in a cloud of Texas dust. The question had been answered, but the story of how he got there, that began 6 weeks ago, with the turning of a different key 6 weeks earlier. The first day, the air on the ranch was clean, quiet. The only sound was the crunch of his worn leather boots on the gravel drive. This wasn't a retirement. Silas knew that much. A man doesn't retire from grief. This was a pilgrimage, an act of atonement. He walked the perimeter of the property, his hand resting on a cedar fence post. Its wood worn smooth by a century of sun and rain. It felt solid, real, a stark contrast to the ghosts he'd been living with in Dallas. A memory flickered, sharp and painful, as it always did when he was alone. His son, Marcus, years ago, spreading old county maps across their small kitchen table, his face alive with passion. The boy's voice, so full of a life that was now gone, echoed in his mind. Dad, this land has a story, a history they tried to erase. We have to get it back. The guilt was a physical weight in Silas's chest, a familiar ache that never truly subsided. A father who couldn't solve his own son's final case. A father who couldn't protect his boy from the very world he'd tried to change. Inside the dusty ranch house, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. Before he unpacked his own sparse belongings, Silas placed a small, worn wooden box on the mantelpiece, Marcus's box. He opened it carefully. Inside, it was all there. The research that had consumed his son's final months, old newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, copies of deeds, and notes, scribbled in the margins in Marcus's messy, urgent handwriting, about land justice, about Whispering Bluffs. Tucked in the corner was a faded photograph of the two of them, taken at a high school football game, their smiles wide and easy. This wasn't just Silas's new home. It was his son's last investigation, A silent promise. 3 days later, he found the first sign of trouble. It wasn't a loud noise or a confrontational neighbor. It was a piece of paper. In the rustic wooden mailbox at the end of his long drive, nestled between advertisements for cattle feed, was an envelope. Ivory cardstock, heavy in his hand. Official? He slid it open with his thumb. Inside, a single sheet. It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. The letterhead was embossed. Whispering Bluffs Homeowners Association, HOA. The language was polite, sterile. But the message was clear. It spoke of aesthetic harmony. It cited community rule. Section 4, paragraph B. It informed him, without any room for discussion, that his livestock fencing was non-compliant. A cold, impersonal notice, signed with a flourish that seemed both elegant and dismissive. By Evelyn Hayes, President. Silas read it twice. His old instincts, dormant for 2 years, kicked in. He had spent 30 years reading police reports, witness statements, and confessions. He knew how to read the language behind the language. This wasn't a friendly reminder. This was a probe, a test, a warning shot across the bow. He folded the letter, the crisp paper making a sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. He walked into his makeshift office, took an empty manila folder from his box of supplies, and placed the letter inside. On the tab, with a black marker, he wrote a single word. Hayes. The new investigation had begun. Of course. Here is part 2. Written in compliance with all established rules and guidelines. The tightening noose. The first HOA meeting Silas attended was not held in a room. It was held in a territory. The community clubhouse, with its polished wood floors and scent of stale coffee, felt less like a gathering place and more like a courtroom. Evelyn Hayes sat at the head of the table, a position that seemed less elected and more ordained. She didn't run the meeting. She presided over it. Her words were smooth, practiced things. She spoke of aesthetic harmony, of protecting our collective investment, of community standards. The words were meant to sound inclusive, like a warm blanket. But Silas, who had spent a lifetime listening to people lie, heard them for what they were. Coded language, fences around people's lives. He waited his turn. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, reasonable. He explained that a cattle ranch required a specific type of fence, for safety, for function. It wasn't a matter of aesthetics. It was a matter of livelihood. Evelyn listened with a patient, almost theatrical smile. When he finished, she didn't address his points. She addressed the room. We are all part of a covenant here at Whispering Bluffs, she said, her gaze sweeping over the other homeowners. And that covenant is a promise we make to each other. A promise to maintain a certain standard. She finally looked at Silas, her smile tightening just a fraction. The rules apply to everyone. Mr. Washington. Without exception, there was no debate, no discussion, just a series of quiet, resigned nods from around the table. Silas looked at the faces of his neighbors, a retired accountant, a young couple with their first child. He saw it in their eyes. Not agreement, but fear. The low-grade, simmering fear of a letter in the mail, a fine, a notice. He had seen that look before, in witness rooms. It was the look of people who had learned it was easier to stay silent. This wasn't a community of neighbors. It was a silent kingdom of subjects, and Evelyn Hayes was their queen. He realized then that she didn't just enforce the rules. She drew her strength from them. A week later, another ivory envelope arrived. It announced the next phase of Evelyn's benevolent reign. A new electronic gate was to be installed at the community's single entrance. The letter was filled with reassuring words: security, protection, peace of mind. But Silas read the subtext: control. Still, when the new keycards were distributed, a small part of him hoped that this was it, that the fence issue would fade, and he would be left alone. The keycard felt cool and anonymous in his hand. A simple piece of plastic, a key, just like everyone else's. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe things would be normal. The normality lasted for exactly 8 days. It was a Monday morning, the sun still low and golden over the hills. He drove his truck up to the gleaming new gate. He held his keycard to the sensor, expecting the familiar, satisfying click and the hum of the motor. Nothing. A small, unapologetic red light blinked at him. He backed up the truck and tried again. Placed the card flat against the sensor. Held it there. Red light. Cold. Final. He called the number for the management office. The same one from the sign. This time, the voice was not cheerful. It was efficient. Robotic. Yes. Mr. Washington, the voice said after a short pause. I see a note on your account. Your access card has been temporarily suspended by order of the board, pending resolution of the covenant violations. The line went quiet. Silas stared through his windshield at the black iron bars. A familiar feeling washed over him, cold and heavy. It was the same hollow punch in the gut he'd felt the day a smug superior officer told him his son's case was being moved to the cold case file. Not closed, not solved, just suspended. It was the language of a system shutting a door in your face. The gate wasn't just metal. It was a symbol, a physical manifestation of a bureaucratic wall, designed to be impenetrable, depending on which side he was on. He was either locked out or locked in. What followed was a slow, grinding education in helplessness. His life now revolved around business hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. If he wanted to get onto his own property, he had to call the office, state his name, and wait for a disembodied voice to grant him entry. He was a visitor at his own home. A delivery of hay from a supplier in San Antonio was turned away because the driver arrived at 5:15. Silas had to pay a redelivery fee. A trip to the hardware store for an emergency plumbing fix became a race against the clock. He made it back to the gate at 5:01. He sat there for 10 minutes, calling the office, getting only voicemail. He ended up leaving his truck on the side of the county road and walking the half-mile back to his house in the fading light. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. A fierce, unexpected thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the house. He heard a sound of distress from the pasture. One of his new calves, only a week old, was down. Her breathing was ragged. Colic, maybe. Or worse, he needed the vet. And he needed her now. He stood in the driving rain, his phone shielded under his coat, pleading with a third-party security guard in a call center somewhere in another state. The guard was polite but firm. He didn't have the authorization. He could log the request. Silas could hear the calf's labored breaths in the distance. He felt a rage building inside him, so potent it almost choked him. A rage mixed with the bitter taste of impotence. After nearly an hour of frantic calls, a different guard, finally, reluctantly, opened the gate remotely. The vet arrived, her headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. By then, it was almost too late. As Silas stood there, soaked to the bone, watching the vet work under the cold glow of a flashlight, he understood the true nature of Evelyn Hayes' strategy. This campaign of 1,000 small cuts, these bureaucratic tortures, they weren't designed to make him comply. They were designed to make him break, to exhaust him, to bleed him dry of money, energy, and hope, to make him give up and leave. The Homeowners Association HOA wasn't just enforcing a rulebook, it was laying a siege. Echoes from the archives. The anger didn't burn hot in Silas's chest. It settled into a cold, familiar weight. The kind of weight he used to feel when a case went sideways, when the pieces didn't fit, when the official story felt like a lie. He was done being a frustrated rancher. The nights of staring at the unmoving gate were over. Now, on the floor of his sparsely furnished living room, he was Detective Washington again. The hardwood became his new precinct desk. He laid everything out. The ivory letters from the HOA, the thick, stapled booklet of covenants and bylaw, the welcome packet that felt more like a book of statutes. Next to them, he carefully placed Marcus's old map, their creases soft with use. It felt right. Seeing them side by side, the present offense, and the past his son had been trying to understand. He started to connect them, not with red yarn, but with the quiet logic of a 30-year career. He circled phrases, highlighted inconsistencies, made notes in the margins with a number 2 pencil. He wasn't just reading rules anymore. He was looking for a pattern, He was building a case file against Evelyn Hayes. He had requested the annual financial reports from the Homeowners Association, HOA, a right afforded to every member. They had arrived a week later, professionally bound, full of pie charts and spreadsheets. To most, they would have been impenetrable, boring. But Silas read them like a witness statement. He traced the flow of money, dues in, expenses out, landscaping, pool chemicals, insurance, standard. But then he found it, tucked away under administrative expenses, a line item from 6 months ago, a check written to a high-end law firm in Austin, one specializing in land use litigation. The description was vague: legal consultation on zoning ordinances. The amount wasn't extravagant enough to raise alarms at a board meeting, but its timing was a quiet scream. It was dated just 2 weeks after the ranch had been listed for sale. Before he had even seen the property, Evelyn Hayes hadn't just reacted to his arrival. She had prepared for it. She had been waiting. The next morning, his investigation took him off the ranch and into the heart of the small town. The county records office was a limestone building that seemed to sag under the weight of the history it held. The air inside smelled of old paper, dust, and time itself. And that was where he met Alma Gutierrez. She was the county archivist, a woman whose quiet presence filled the large, silent room. She moved between the towering shelves of ledgers with a practiced ease, her silver hair tied back in a simple bun. Her eyes, behind a pair of no-nonsense reading glasses, missed nothing. Silas started his request simply. He asked for the original plat maps for the Whispering Bluffs development, the property deeds for his parcel, the recorded history of the access easement. For 2 days, Alma simply did her job, pulling the heavy books, pointing him to the right microfilm reader, leaving him to his work. She saw him there from open to close, a broad-shouldered man hunched over documents, his focus absolute. She noticed he wasn't looking at property values or zoning changes like the developers were. He was looking backward, always backward. On the third day, as he was carefully photographing a brittle, hand-drawn map from the 1952nd, she walked over to his table. "You're not looking for a loophole," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You're looking for a foundation." Silas looked up from his phone, surprised by her directness. He met her gaze. He saw no judgment there, only a deep, knowing curiosity. So he made a choice. He told her, not everything, not about Marcus, but about the fence, the gate, the feeling of being caged on his own land. He spoke in the clipped, factual tone of a detective giving a report, but Alma heard the exhaustion underneath. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, looking at the map spread between them. "My grandfather," she said finally, her finger tracing a faint line that marked an old creek bed, "used to own a piece of land just north of here, had to sell it during the drought in the 50s. The family who bought it, they rerouted the creek a few years later, legally. But it changed everything. Some things, once they're gone, you can't get back." It wasn't a story about the law. It was a story about loss. A quiet understanding passed between them. Two people who knew what it was to have something taken. "Let me look at something," Alma said, a new energy in her step. She disappeared into the stacks and returned with a different kind of map. It was older, a master plan from the initial development survey. She spread it carefully on the table. "Most people only look at the new surveys," she explained. "The digital ones. They're clean, easy to read, but sometimes they leave things out." Her finger landed on the small strip of land where the gate stood. On the new maps, it was just part of the road, but on this old one, it was clearly outlined with its own distinct border. And inside that border, in faded, elegant cursive, were a few crucial words. "Parcel 7B. Alma read aloud. Property of the Peterson family." Silas leaned in, his heart beating a little faster. It wasn't community property. It wasn't an easement owned by the HOA. It was a separate piece of land. A private piece of land. Hope, he knew, was a dangerous thing for a man in his position. It could make you reckless. But this wasn't just hope. This was a lead. A crack in the wall. To a detective, a crack was all you ever needed to bring the whole thing down. Silas's journey has just begun. Is an old map enough to fight the power of an HOA? What other secrets are hidden behind that gate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to follow part 4, where the race for the key truly begins. The race for the key. The hunt for the Petersons was a return to the painstaking work Silas knew best. It was a slow, methodical process. A journey through digital breadcrumbs and cold trails. Public records. Old tax documents Alma unearthed from the county basement. It took them a week, but they finally found him. Arthur Peterson, age 87. Living in a small, quiet town just outside Portland, Oregon. Silas made the call from his kitchen table, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. He could hear the faint sound of wind chimes on the other end of the line as Mr. Peterson answered, his voice thin and reedy. Silas explained who he was and why he was calling. There was a long pause. Lot 7B, Arthur Peterson repeated. The name, a strange artifact from a life he'd long since left behind. Goodness. I vaguely remember my father talking about a sliver of land in Texas. A leftover. Thought we sold all that off years ago. He chuckled. A dry, rustling sound. Son, that piece of dirt is probably not worth the paper the deed is written on. Why, and irrespective the back to now, Silas looked out the window at the imposing black iron gate that stood between him and the rest of the world. To you, maybe not. Mr. Peterson, Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. But to me, it's worth everything. This is better all watching for the Dan so. Just as one door seemed to be opening, another began to close. That evening, Silas received a call from a blocked number. He almost didn't answer. A man's voice, hushed and nervous, came through the line. Silas recognized him from the HOA Finance Committee. A quiet man who had avoided his gaze at the last meeting. She knows, the man whispered, getting straight to the point. Evelyn, she knows you've been looking into the Peterson parcel. She's calling an emergency board meeting. For tomorrow night, the man took a shaky breath. She's going to have the Homeowners Association HOA vote to acquire it. Using the reserve fund, she's calling it a security necessity. And as his native despite it was a vast of the timed and his lucian, with that this is so my time, with matey first app. The race had begun. Silas hung up the phone. The silence in the room feeling heavy. He walked over to his desk and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger, the kind he'd used for years to track his personal finances. He wasn't a rich man. His police pension was modest. The ranch had taken nearly everything he had saved. Buying this new parcel, it would be a gamble. A huge one. It would mean cashing out the small investment portfolio he'd set aside for his later years. The one meant for true retirement, not for legal battles. He looked at the numbers. The cold, hard facts of his financial reality. Then he looked up at the mantelpiece. At the picture of him and Marcus, the boy was smiling. A future in his eyes that had never come to be. This wasn't about a secure retirement anymore. It was about a promise. He picked up the phone and dialed Oregon again. He didn't start with the money. He started with the truth. He told Mr. Peterson about the gate, about being locked out of his own home. He spoke of the sleepless nights, of the feeling of helplessness. He spoke of his son's dream for this very land. He wasn't a buyer making a pitch. He was a man asking for a lifeline. His voice was weary, but it was honest, and that honesty traveled across the country, through the phone line, and into the quiet living room of a stranger. The Petersons, stunned into silence, said they would talk it over with their children. But Evelyn Hayes did not play by the same rules of honesty and trust. Her moves were made in the shadows. The scene shifts to Evelyn's immaculate home office, overlooking the rolling hills of her own vast property. She was on the phone, her voice a mixture of sweet tea and pure steel. On the other end was Sheriff Brody Thompson. Brody, dear, she said, swirling the ice in her glass. I have a small favor to ask. It's a community security matter, she explained, in vague but pointed terms, that an out-of-state party with an interest in a sensitive piece of local land needed to be vetted. I was hoping. she continued, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. That you could have one of your counterparts up in Oregon just pay them a friendly visit. A welfare check. Perhaps. Let them know that we in Whispering Bluffs take our community's integrity very, very seriously. Thanks for watching To Wanting Live. It wasn't a request. It was an order, wrapped in the silk of southern pleasantries. 2 days later, a uniformed sheriff's deputy, large and imposing in his Oregon County uniform, walked up the gravel path to Arthur Peterson's small, peaceful home. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't rude. He was polite. But his presence, the official car parked at the curb, the notepad in his hand, was a message in itself. He asked questions about the land in Texas. He asked if they had been contacted by anyone. He said he was just doing his due diligence on behalf of concerned citizens back in Whispering Bluffs. The visit was brief, but the feeling it left behind was a cold, creeping unease, an invisible pressure. It was the shadow of Evelyn Hayes, long enough to stretch all the way to Oregon. The detective's gambit. The call from Oregon came late that afternoon. It was Mrs. Peterson, and the calm, grandmotherly warmth was gone from her voice. In its place was a tremor of fear. Mr. Washington, she began, her voice strained. A man was just here. A sheriff. From your county down in Texas? Sheriff Thompson. Silas felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones. Evelyn wasn't playing games any. He was polite. Mrs. Peterson continued. Very polite. But he asked so many questions. About how long we've owned the land. If we were planning on selling. He mentioned community safety. He mentioned trespassing. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the silence between them. A man with a badge doesn't travel 1,000 miles to make small talk. He comes to deliver a message. Silas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in the quiet. He could hear the fear in her voice, and his first instinct was a flash of his own anger. But anger was a luxury. It clouded judgment. He let the feeling pass, and what was left was the calm focus of a detective working a case. Mrs. Peterson, he said, his voice low and steady, a calming counterpoint to her anxiety. That visit wasn't about safety. It was about fear. That's how Miss Hayes operates. She wants you to be afraid. She wants you to think this is more trouble than it's worth. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you this. I believe in the law, and I believe in doing what's right. He looked over at the open wooden box on his desk, at his son's neatly organized files. This isn't just about me, and it isn't just about a gate. That piece of land has been in your family for over a century. It's a part of your history. He made a quick decision. He scanned and emailed her a few pages from Marcus's research, the old deeds, the family names tracing back generations. I'm sending you something my son put together, he said. He cared about this place. He cared about its story. I'm not just asking you to sell me a piece of land. I'm asking you to help me honor its history, your family's history. He was no longer just a buyer. He was appealing to them as custodians of a legacy. Back in Whispering Bluffs, the emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had been called to order. The air in the clubhouse was thick with tension. Evelyn Hayes stood before the board, a portrait of civic concern. Her voice was grave, her words carefully chosen. An unforeseen and urgent matter has come to our attention, she began, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the board members. She spoke of the critical security implications of Parcel 7B. She painted a grim picture of a stranger, an outside party, holding the only key to their homes, their safety. She never mentioned Silas by name. She didn't have to. He was the nameless, faceless threat she was conjuring in the room. We have a fiduciary duty, she declared, her voice rising with passion, a responsibility to protect the integrity and security of this community. We must acquire this parcel, immediately. Some board members nodded along, caught in the web of her rhetoric, but Silas's quiet informant, the man from the finance committee, fidgeted in his seat. He looked at the numbers. The reserve fund was meant for emergencies, a failed septic system, a damaged roof. Using a substantial portion of it to buy a tiny strip of land felt extreme. For the first time, a hairline crack appeared in Evelyn's monolithic authority. A flicker of doubt. Evelyn sensed it. She pressed her advantage, moving toward a final vote. "I therefore move," she announced, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel, "that the board authorize the immediate purchase of Parcel 7B. As her words echoed in the silent room, her phone, sitting face down on the polished table, vibrated. Once. A text message. She ignored it. 9. For the continued security of the Whispering Bluffs community. She finished. A board member loyal to her quickly seconded the motion. "All in favor?" Evelyn asked. A confident, almost predatory smile forming on her lips. Her phone vibrated again. Insistently this time, annoyed. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from her lawyer. 6 words. "The Peterson parcel has been sold." The confident smile on Evelyn Hayes's face did not just vanish. It froze, then cracked. For a split second, the mask of the poised community leader fell away, revealing a raw, potent fury underneath. Her knuckles turned white where she gripped the edge of the table. Her control, the one thing she valued above all else, had slipped through her fingers. The board members stared, confused by her sudden silence. The motion hung in the air. Han answered. The scene dissolves, returning to the present moment, to Silas in his old Ford truck, driving past a stunned Evelyn Hayes. We now understand the journey that led to this quiet, powerful act. It wasn't just the opening of a gate. It was the culmination of an investigation, a financial gamble, a quiet appeal to decency, and a battle for the soul of a small piece of Texas land. Silas parked the truck in front of his ranch house and killed the engine. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there, listening to the familiar sounds of his land, the lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets in the tall grass. He knew this was far from over. A woman like Evelyn Hayes did not accept defeat. The lawsuit would come next. He was sure of it. The war had just begun. But tonight, for the first time in many weeks, the wind rustling through the live oaks didn't sound like a mournful sigh. It sounded like a whisper of hope. The legal battlefield. For 3 days, a tense quiet settled over Whispering Bluffs. The gate, now under Silas's control, opened and closed smoothly for the residents. They would drive through, some offering a hesitant wave, others just staring straight ahead, unsure of the new world order. Silas, methodical as ever, had issued new key cards to every household. Every household. That is, except for the 5 members of the HOA board. For them, he established a new protocol, outlined in a polite, formal email. Access through Parcel 7B, his private property, would require a written request submitted to him via email 24 hours in advance. It was a bureaucratic maneuver, a perfect, cold mirror of the treatment he had received. He wasn't denying them access. He was just making them ask for it. In her immaculate home office overlooking the rolling hills, Evelyn Hayes was not screaming. She was not throwing the expensive crystal paperweight that sat on her desk. She was perfectly still, her hands folded, her posture impeccable. She stared out the large picture window, her eyes fixed on the distant fence line of Silas Washington's ranch. The silence in the room was heavier, more dangerous than any shout could ever be. This was no longer about a covenant violation. It was no longer about aesthetic harmony or property values. This was about a legacy. Her family had shaped this land for 100 years. They had set the standards. They had maintained the order. And this man, this quiet, stubborn detective, had undone a piece of that order with a single, vulgar real estate transaction. His very presence on that specific piece of land was an affront, a living reminder of a historical loose end her ancestors had failed to tie up. It was a crack in the pristine facade she had spent her life maintaining. She picked up her phone. She did not dial. She simply pressed a single contact on the screen. "David Dadded," she said when her lawyer answered, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Sue him. Use the reserve funds. I don't care what it costs. I want him buried in legal fees. I want that gate back." It was not a request. It was an order. 2 days later, Sheriff Brody Thompson's patrol car turned onto the gravel road leading to Silas's ranch. The dust plumed up behind him, a reluctant announcement of his arrival. Brody was a big man, his uniform straining slightly at the shoulders. His face usually set in an expression of weary contentment. Today, he just looked tired. He had received the call from Evelyn. An anonymous complaint, she had said, her voice smooth as silk over the phone. A concern about animal welfare at the Washington property. Neglect. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Silas met him at the porch, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He didn't look surprised. He just looked disappointed. "Sheriff," he said, his voice even. "Washington." Brody nodded, avoiding his eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere over Silas's shoulder. "Got a call. Have to check it out. Protocol. The Brapses has made 'em, but it's subscribe." He walked through the pastures with Silas. He saw the healthy cattle grazing peacefully, the clean water troughs, the bales of fresh hay stacked neatly in the barn. There was no neglect here. There was only care. Hard work. He felt a knot of shame tighten in his gut. He remembered, years ago, when his wife's medical bills were piling up, how the Hayes family had quietly organized a community fund that paid for everything. Evelyn had never mentioned it again, but it was always there between them. A debt. A leash. He stood beside Silas. Two men who had spent their lives on different sides of the law, but who both understood the weight of duty. "Your animals look fine, Washington," Brody said, his voice gruff. He finally met Silas's gaze. "You take care of yourself out here." It was the closest he could come to an apology. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving the unspoken threat hanging in the air. The visit wasn't an investigation. It was a reminder that Evelyn's reach extended far beyond the HOA. The official summons arrived the next week, delivered by a tight-lipped courier. It was thick, heavy, full of dense legal language. Silas read it at his kitchen table, a cup of black coffee growing cold beside him. The Homeowners Association HOA was suing him for control of the gate. Their claim, a prescriptive easement. They argued that because the community had used and maintained the access road for more than 30 years, they had earned a legal right to it, regardless of his ownership. He met with his lawyer, Imani Vance, the next day. She laid out the reality of the situation in stark terms. They have a case, Silas. A prescriptive easement claim is hard to fight. It's not about who owns the deed. It's about historical use. This will be a long, expensive battle. Discovery, depositions, court fees. Evelyn knows you're not a wealthy man. She's not trying to win in court. Not yet. She's trying to bleed you dry so you're forced to sell. That's agreed of that work. That rel Baxton the agree. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the financial statement Imani had placed on the table between them. His retirement account, his savings, the money he had planned to live on for the rest of his life. He saw the numbers, and he saw them dwindling with every projected legal fee. This was Evelyn's second front, the war of attrition. To break him, financially, he was silent for a long time. The only sound in the small office, the hum of the air conditioning. He thought of his son, Marcus. He thought of the passion in his son's voice when he talked about fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. Finally, he looked up at Imani, his eyes clear and resolved. "My son wouldn't have backed down," he said simply. "Neither will I. Think you mind a sprint begins later." The buried truth. The lawsuit from the Homeowners Association HOA was a declaration of war. But Alma Gutierrez knew that some battles are fought in the quiet of the archive, not the noise of a courtroom. It was more than a hunch that kept her late at the county records office, long after the last employee had gone home. It was a feeling, a whisper from the shelves, a sense that the story of the gate wasn't about an easement dispute from the 1982nd. Its roots went deeper, much deeper. So she stopped looking for modern deeds. She stopped looking for bylaws. She went to the oldest section of the archives, a room in the basement where the air was cool and thick with the scent of decaying paper and time itself. She was looking for the very beginning, the genesis of the Whispering Bluffs Ranch. She found it on the third night. inside a massive, leather-bound ledger from 1878. The cover was cracked, the spine held together by faith and fabric. Her fingers, gentle as a surgeon's, turned the brittle, yellowed pages. She traced the property lines with a gloved finger, following the chain of ownership back, until she found the original transaction. And there it was, not typed, but written in a looping, elegant cursive. The iron gall ink faded to a ghostly brown. It was a special provision, handwritten into the margin of the deed as a condition of the original sale that created the surrounding parcels. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words aloud in a whisper. And be it known that the owner of the primary ranch parcel shall, in perpetuity, hold unobstructed priority access for all agricultural thoroughfares connected to said property. Axway, but also de, unobstructed, priority, in perpetuity. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for Silas, but for the long-dead farmer who had the foresight to protect his land with a handful of words. It wasn't just evidence. It was the sound of a promise, kept across a century. It was the voice of history itself, speaking up from the dust. But the historian in Alma was now fully awake. One discovery only led to another question. If this clause existed, why had no one ever mentioned it? Possessed by a cold, investigative fire, she didn't stop. She began to cross-reference the deeds of the surrounding properties from that same era. The late 1802nd, the early 1902nd. She pulled tax records, foreclosure notices, and, slowly, a dark and disturbing pattern began to emerge from the faded ink. The name Hayes, again, and again, and again. She saw a pattern of legal challenges, of sudden, unexplained tax liens appearing on properties owned by Black and Mexican American families. She saw deeds of sale, signed under pressure, for prices that were a fraction of their worth, all sold to the Hayes family. The next afternoon, she sat with Silas at his kitchen table. She laid the documents out, one by one. They weren't just papers anymore. They were tombstones, marking the death of dozens of family dreams. The pieces clicked into place with the grim finality of a coffin lid closing. The quiet questions that had bothered Silas from the beginning now had answers. Why was Evelyn so obsessed with his fence? Why was she willing to go to such extreme lengths over a minor covenant? It was never about the gate. Evelyn Hayes wasn't just protecting the rules of her homeowners association, HOA. She was protecting a secret, a century-old secret about how her family's fortune was built, piece by piece, on the ruins of other people's lives. His ranch, the one founded by a savvy Black farmer who had protected it with a legal firewall, it was the one that got away. It was a living, breathing testament to her family's failure to conquer all. His very presence was a threat to the carefully constructed myth of her family's legacy. Silas sat there for a long time, the silence broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. He now held the key to winning his lawsuit. The 1878 clause was an ironclad defense. It would be a quick, clean victory. He could present that one document, and this nightmare would be over. But then there was the other pile of documents. The pile that told the story of the other families. Exposing that would not be a clean win. It would be a bomb dropped on the entire foundation of Whispering Bluffs. It would mean turning a personal fight into a public reckoning. He slowly stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up the faded photograph of him and Marcus. He looked at his son's smiling, hopeful face. He remembered the boy's passion, his fire for land justice. Marcus wouldn't have settled for just opening a gate. He would have demanded the truth. For everyone, Silas placed the photo back on the mantel. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer his fight alone. It was his. It was Marcus's, and it was for all the forgotten names in Alma's dusty ledgers. We have walked a long road with Silas, from a father's grief to the threshold of a terrible truth. His choice will decide the fate of an entire community. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting with the number 1 below, so I know that I still have friends journeying with me. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part, where the truth comes to light and justice is decided in Whispering Bluffs. The reckoning at Whispering Bluffs. The day of the hearing, The air in the small county courthouse was thick and still, as if the whole town were holding its breath. The room was packed. On one side, Evelyn Hayes sat ramrod straight, flanked by her expensive lawyer. She was the picture of composure, dressed in a tailored navy suit, the embodiment of civic order. On the other side sat Silas, flanked by Imani and Alma. He wore no suit, just a clean, pressed denim shirt and his work jeans, the clothes of a man who belonged to the land, not a boardroom. It was a silent statement. The lawyer for the Homeowners Association, HOA, went first. He was slick, professional, and very convincing. He presented a mountain of evidence: 30 years of maintenance receipts for the road leading to the gate, photographs of HOA-funded landscaping around the entrance, signed affidavits from longtime residents who stated they had always considered the gate and its access road to be HOA property. He argued the case for a prescriptive easement, a right earned through decades of undisputed use. It was a logical, powerful argument, built on the solid foundation of recent history. As he spoke, Silas could feel the mood in the courtroom shifting. The logic was on their side. The momentum was theirs. The law, it seemed, favored the status quo. Then, it was Imani Vance's turn. She walked to the podium, a single, thin file in her hand. She didn't look at the HOA's lawyer or his mountain of evidence. She looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Opposing counsel has presented a compelling case for the last 30 years. We are here today to talk about the last 140. She placed a certified copy of the original 1,878 deed on the judge's bench, the foundational document of the land itself. This deed, she explained, the very document that created the parcel my client now owns, contains an explicit, legally binding covenant. It guarantees the owner of the ranch priority and unimpeded access across all agricultural thoroughfares connected to the property. That right, Your Honor, predates this HOA by a century. It is not a right earned by use. It is a right carved into the land itself." A murmur went through the courtroom. But Imani wasn't finished. The deed was only the beginning. To understand the full context of this document, she continued, "I would like to call Miss Alma Gutierrez to the stand." As an expert on local history, Alma walked to the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. But when she began to speak, her voice was firm. Imani guided her with gentle questions. Alma explained the history of the ranch, its founding by a freed black family after the Civil War. Then, Imani asked her about the surrounding parcels. With methodical calm, Alma presented her research. She spoke of other minority-owned farms in the area during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She read from the public record, detailing a pattern of legal challenges, tax lien, and property seizures. One by one, these properties had been acquired, often for pennies on the dollar, by a single, powerful founding family. She never said the name. She didn't need to. She just presented the facts, the dates, the parcel numbers, the transaction records. She was not an accuser. She was an archivist, a keeper of memory. She was giving a voice to the silent ink in the dusty ledgers. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The case about an easement had suddenly become a quiet tribunal on the history of Whispering Bluffs itself. Every eye in the room, except for Silas's, was on Evelyn Hayes. The mask of serene composure finally shattered. "She's lying?" Evelyn snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "This is a slanderous attack on my family's history. It has nothing to do with this case." Her eyes were wild, a cornered animal's panic replacing the cool condescension. The outburst was a confession, more powerful than any document. In that moment, everyone saw her not as a community leader, but as the desperate guardian of a dark secret. The judge's gavel came down hard. Once. Twice. "Sit down, Mrs. Hayes." The final ruling was swift. The judge spoke directly to the legal matter. "The court finds that the original deed and its explicit covenant take precedence over any claim of a prescriptive easement. The case brought by the Homeowners Association, HOA, is dismissed." Then, He took off his glasses and looked directly at Evelyn. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. This court was asked to rule on an access road, and it has. But the testimony presented here today by Miss Gutierrez paints a deeply troubling picture of this community's history. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. That is a matter for other forum, and for the consciences of those who live here. It was more than a legal defeat. It was a moral judgment, delivered in the quiet, unassailable language of the law. Justice for the ones before. The verdict in the courtroom was not an explosion. It was a quiet tremor that cracked the foundations of Whispering Bluffs. In the weeks that followed, the aftershocks continued. Evelyn Hayes did not make a scene. She simply vanished from public life. Her name was quietly removed from the community newsletter. Her iron grip on the HOA was broken, leaving it a power vacuum and a bewildered board. The Homeowners Association HOA itself fell into a state of chaos, forced to confront not just a legal defeat, but a moral reckoning. An official county inquiry was launched into the historical land transactions Alma's research had uncovered. A slow, grinding process that promised to keep the town's secrets in the light for a long time to come. A week after the trial, a short article appeared in the local paper. Sheriff Brody Thompson had submitted his resignation, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons. There was no further explanation. The debt he owed had finally been paid in full. People started coming to the ranch. They came one by one, hesitantly at first. An elderly woman whose grandfather had lost his farm in the 30s. A young man who had heard stories from his grandmother about the land their family used to own. They were the descendants of the names Alma had found in the dusty ledgers. They came to Silas not as a hero, but as a man who had shown them that the past was not a closed book. He did not become a loud leader or an activist. That was never his way. He simply invited them onto his porch, poured them a glass of iced tea, and listened. He would bring out Marcus's old wooden box, lay out the research, and share what his son had started. He showed them how to find the records. He gave them the name of his lawyer, Imani Vance. He didn't offer them victory. He just offered them a starting point, a map to begin their own quiet journeys toward justice. Several months passed. The Texas summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The chaos in the community began to settle into a new, more honest kind of order. One afternoon, Alma Gutierrez's car pulled up the gravel drive. Silas met her with a nod, and they sat together in the 2 rocking chairs on his porch, the same ones that had been there when he first arrived. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the cattle graze in the distance, the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of a cow, the buzz of insects. The rustle of the wind through the live oaks filled the space between them. There were no more mysteries to solve, no more documents to find. There was only this, a hard-won peace. "You did a great thing, Silas," Alma said finally, her eyes on the horizon. "What you did here, it mattered. Marcus would have been so proud. Speeded to speeding that place of the created." Silas continued to rock, his gaze steady. He heard his son's name, and for the first time, the familiar, sharp sting of guilt wasn't there. In its place was a quiet, profound warmth, a sense of completion. He knew the ache of losing his son would never truly disappear, that it would always be a part of him, like a phantom limb. But the heavy burden of his failure, the feeling that he had let his son down, had finally been lifted. He had finished the case. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the limestone hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Silas walked alone down his long driveway. He stopped at the gate. It stood wide open, its black iron arms seeming to welcome the world in rather than keep it out. He didn't look at it. His focus was on the land beyond, the rolling hills that held so many stories. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. From it, he took a faded photograph, its corners soft from years of being carried. A picture of him and a smiling, vibrant Marcus, taken at a fishing trip long ago. He held it in his calloused hand, the setting sun catching the image. He had come here seeking peace but found a fight. He had come seeking atonement but found justice. Silas Washington hadn't just bought a key to a gate, he had unlocked a door that had been sealed by history, barred by secrets and fear. And here, in the quiet of the Texas Hill Country, he had finally found his way home, not just for himself, but for the echoes of all the ones who came before. How do you respond when the world tries to break you? The story of Silas Washington began with a fence, a physical barrier meant to isolate and defeat him. But his response shows us a profound truth. The most powerful fences aren't made of iron, but of rules, fear, and forgotten history. And to overcome them, you don't need a sledgehammer. You need wisdom. Silas didn't just buy a gate key, he reclaimed a piece of the past and, in doing so, forged a new future for his community. His story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about loud confrontations, but about the quiet, unyielding courage to seek the truth. What part of Silas's quiet fight resonated most with you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. If you appreciate stories that explore the deeper currents of justice and resilience, we invite you to subscribe to Deepu Kader Stories. Thank you for being here and for listening with an open heart.